Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. Now that my obligatory informative videos are done for the day, it's time to talk about current events in the online fitness community. And I had an article come through my feed that Call Parter put up at T Nation that I want to share with you guys a little bit. And I'll link the article down below in the comments, and I'll probably make it a top comment so you guys can get to it easy enough. But Paul in this article broke down a study, which I think I discussed with you guys a while back. And this is important that we look at volume studies like this because you have stuff like Dr. Brad's study that he came out, which is very heavily debated. Only a certain circle of people are accepting it. It's been a point of controversy. I jumped into the discussion on that, the debate that Lyle had with Dr. Mike over it. And the problem is that it's been the only study that's had those sort of results. It's showing something like 45 sets for legs per week produced more muscle growth than 30 sets and nonsense like that. And I don't want people to think that I'm saying that volume isn't a large driver of hypertrophy, but when you get to your bigger exercises, it isn't going to work. And what Paul breaks down is this study that looks at this stuff. And it's a study that was done on women, and they put them into 4 groups. And these were all women, average age 24 to 25. They all had at least 3 years of training experience. And they used women for a reason. Women tend to be more resilient to training volume than men. So there's a reason they chose women for a volume study. So women don't actually overtrain as easily as a result of volume, generally. So it tends to be in their favor for this of finding really ideal upper thresholds for volume. And they put them on a 3-day week program. Now, it was a body part split, and he did address that, meaning it was basically a push-pull legs 3 days a week. But they put them in a 5-set group, 10-set group, 15-set group, 20-set group. And to give you guys an idea, it's basically like the 5-set group. They did 2 sets of flat bench, 2 sets of incline, and 1 set of overhead press. And then you can extrapolate it out from there to where like the final group for the 20 sets was 7 sets of bench press, 7 sets of incline, 6 sets of overhead press. And then so on and so forth for the different body parts. So they basically had a pulling day, which was like a back and bicep day. They had a chest and shoulder and tricep day, and then they had a leg day, which included stiff leg deadlifts as one of the exercises. So when you're looking at the 20 sets for legs, that's including deadlifting. It was leg presses, squats, stiff leg deadlifts. Those are 3 exercises spread into a total of 5, 10, 15, and 25 sets per week. Now, the interesting thing when you look at this data, and really what Paul outlines all of that in the article, he goes through his own take on it. What you find was that the best results were in the 5 and 10 set group, depending upon which muscles and exercises we looked at. And the take home from that is that only about 10 reps in any given session for any set of muscles seems to improve size and strength maximally, because what you found was a general downward trend from there. And what they found is that whichever volume groups gained the most muscle, gained the most 10 rep strength when they tested their 10 rep maxes on these exercises, right? So in other words, the group that got the highest strength gains on their 10 rep max on the bench press also got the most muscle in their pecs and triceps and so on, which is what we would expect because progressive overload is the primary driver of hypertrophy. Now, volume matters, and volume matters so much as volume doesn't reduce your progressive overload, and that's the problem there. When volume starts to interfere with your ability to add weight to the bar, volume no longer benefits you in terms of gaining muscle. And that's what people need to remember. In fact, we can add extra volume to certain exercises. You can add other small exercises in, right? Just like me, at the end of each of my bicep workouts, I do 5 sets of hammer curls right now, right? I do 5 sets of hammer curls. That extra volume of that small exercise can thicken some muscles up, but it's not a massive amount of volume. I'm also doing 5 sets of JM presses after my bench press sessions. But again, if you start looking at the total number of real work sets of sort of rep ranges and volumes they're talking about here, if you're coming in and you're adding 5 extra sets of some smaller accessory movements at the end of a big workout, you're staying kind of within these thresholds of what they're finding. But again, it's because you're using smaller exercises. And I'm going to read an excerpt that Paul had to say in here. Is he pointed out that some of the people, would you change the program by having them hit each group twice a week? And he's like, I wouldn't. To me, this study represents a large enough sample size with enough volume variations to see that some Awesome strength and size gains can be made by training 3 days a week and hitting each muscle once during that training week. The real-world anecdote evidence tends to back this up. You can indeed train just 3 times a week, hitting a muscle once during that week, and make outstanding progress. And he's right to some extent. And the take home here is that for any given workout, and he says per week here, I am one of the people who falls into that other category that would take argument with that. I don't think you can maximize muscle growth training a muscle once a week. I think it needs to be hit at least twice. And that's my perspective on it. All the data I've seen over the years suggests that, all my observations. But if progressive overload is there, and this is the point that he makes, this is essentially what point Paul is making in this article. If progressive overload is there and sufficient training volume is there, you can get really, really good gains off of hitting an exercise or a muscle group only once a week. But progressive overload has to be present for that to happen. In other words, if you're not progressing very, very effectively on your work sets, once a week is not going to produce good muscle growth. It's just not. And that's a simple reality. And that's the point that he made here, is that the people who were doing too many sets, it represented junk volume. And what do we mean by junk volume? Volume that interferes with your ability to lift more weight. And I think that's how I would address it also. Volume that interferes with your recovery and adaptations, because they weren't necessarily exceeding their maximum recoverable volume. What you need to remember with any given training session, you have an adaptation window after. And that's what we saw in this study. You have an adaptation window after, and during part of your recovery period, you are not growing. And so if you are spending more time recovering to junk volume than you are adapting, your progress is going to slow. In other words, you're not going to have quite as big of a growth window after the training. And if you have insufficient volume, you're not going to see progressive overload, because you're not going to grow either, because you're not going to disrupt the system. And so that sweet spot probably is somewhere in that range of, again, if you're working these sort of rep ranges, something in the range of 5 to 10 sets in a given session for any given set of muscles. That's probably your sweet spot for most people for doing that. And so there's your problem, is that when you do see these body part type splits, where they have you coming in and doing 15 sets or 20 sets for one muscle in a single workout, look at this data. You have a study that looks at that, and what did it find? They gained less muscle. They gained less muscle and less strength, all the way across the board. And so I would be one of those people who would say, hey, you should probably split things up a little more, maybe go to a 4-day-a-week program with an upper-lower or something like that. And that's the direction I personally would have taken it. And Paul disagrees, and I can understand his perspective on that, because this was essentially a minimalist program, just looking at volume on a few exercises, and it worked. You saw good gains. The 10-set group actually made good gains in strength and muscle, and these are women who had been training for at least 3 years already. So it was a well-programmed program, mostly effective exercises picked. It was periodized. It was using weekly periodization for 24 weeks, and they saw good progress with a focus on progressive overload. But the point, again, we come back to, is that the 20-set group saw the worst gains in muscle. They only saw about 1/4 of the muscle growth that the 10-group set did. 1/4 of the growth for doing twice the volume. And it's simply because they were doing too much volume without enough focus on progressive overload. There was a threshold to where when you try to do too many sets, you're just reducing weight on the bar. And that reduced weight on the bar doesn't do much. And that's why I tell guys who say, hey, you believe in a reverse pyramid training, to where you just drop the weight and keep doing more sets. And it's like, no, not really. Because at a certain threshold, that just turns into junk volume. That turns into junk volume, and you're just reducing tension. And at the end of the day, tension is your biggest driving factor for muscle growth. It really is. More volume will increase muscle growth, as long as it's volume that you can, number one, recover from, and number two, volume that is not forcing you to reduce tension on your big lifts. And that's ultimately what it comes down to. So I thought it was a good article, and I might not necessarily agree with him on the frequency issue here, but I like that Paul took apart this study. He gave his own spin on it, and Paul is someone who himself is a phenomenal lifter. He's a good coach. He's coached a lot of really good lifters. And for those of you who aren't even interested just in powerlifting, okay, yeah, Paul's benched 500 raw and comp. He's over a 700-pound deadlifter. but he's also jacked, and the guy is lean and knows how to get cut and has a six-pack. So for those of you guys who are into the bodybuilding thing, he basically looks like a bodybuilder. So he kind of has the best of both worlds, depending upon what your outlook is. And Paul's a pretty smart guy. He's a pretty knowledgeable guy with a lot of experience, and I like his work. I like 90% of what he does. I only disagree with about 10% of what this guy does. So I just appreciate the fact that he took the time to take this article, to take this study, take it apart, and give his own spin on it, because it was an interesting study for us to look at. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.